There are diesel engines that become famous because they are everywhere. And then there are engines that become legendary because they are almost nowhere. The Scania DC16 belongs in the second category. A 16.4-liter V8 diesel from Sweden, built to pull enormous loads with the kind of effortless strength that makes a driver forget how heavy the trailer really is. In Europe, Australia, and other parts of the world, the Scania V8 became a symbol of serious trucking. It powered long-haul rigs, heavy-haul machines, construction equipment, marine applications, generators, and industrial machinery. But cross the Atlantic, and something strange happens. The name that commands respect on roads around the world becomes almost invisible in American trucking. No familiar Scania V8 sitting beside a Peterbilt at a truck stop. No wall of Scania cabs moving freight across Interstate 80. No DC16 dominating the American heavy-haul scene. So what happened? Did the engine fail? Did Scania build something Americans didn't want? Or was the truth far more complicated? Because the story of the DC16 isn't really about an engine disappearing. It's about an engine being built for a trucking world that evolved very differently from the one Americans knew. And once you understand that, the DC16 starts looking less like a forgotten European curiosity, and more like one of the most fascinating heavy-duty diesels America never fully embraced. To understand why, we have to go back before the DC16 became the monster it is today. Scania's V8 story began decades earlier. In 1969, Scania introduced a 14-liter, 90-degree V8 producing around 350 horsepower. At a time when heavy trucks were demanding more pulling power, the V8 was designed around a simple idea. Make the engine strong enough that the truck doesn't have to fight for every mile. That mattered in Scandinavia. The roads were different. The terrain could be brutal. Timber hauling demanded serious low-speed pulling power. Heavy combinations needed engines that could make usable power without constantly screaming at the top of the tachometer. The V8 became part of Scania's identity. But eventually, even a legendary engine reaches its limit. By the 1990s, emissions rules were tightening. Fuel efficiency mattered more. Customers wanted more power without simply adding more displacement. And Scania knew the old 14-liter V8 couldn't carry the company forever. So engineers began developing something new. The answer was the D16 platform. A larger V8 designed for a new generation of heavy-duty work. When the 16-liter V8 arrived around the turn of the millennium, it represented a major step forward. Early versions produced approximately 480 and 580 horsepower, with torque reaching as high as 2,700 Nm. Put that number into perspective. That's roughly 1,990 pound-feet of torque. And this wasn't a racing engine. It was designed to move freight. The philosophy was completely different from simply building an engine that made a huge peak horsepower number. Scania wanted power that could actually be used. That meant pulling hard at low engine speeds. Fewer unnecessary gear changes. Strong response when the road tilted upward. And enough torque spread that the truck could stay in the right gear instead of constantly hunting for another one. That characteristic would become one of the defining personalities of the DC16. But there was another engineering decision hidden inside the design. Modularization. Scania designed the V8 so that many components could share architecture with its inline engines. That might sound like an engineering footnote. It wasn't. For a truck fleet, commonality matters. If mechanics already understand the architecture, parts and service procedures become easier to manage. Training becomes simpler. Production becomes more efficient. The engine isn't just a machine. It's part of an entire ecosystem. And Scania was building that ecosystem around the V8. Then came the next transformation. The 16-liter platform continued evolving as emissions regulations became more demanding. The displacement increased from roughly 15.6 liters to 16.4 liters. And Scania introduced a lighter but stronger compacted graphite iron cylinder block. The engine was getting bigger. But some of its structure was getting smarter. Then, in 2010, everything changed. Scania unveiled the R730. A 730 horsepower V8. 350,000? No. 350 Newton meters? Not even close. The engine could produce 3,500 Newton meters of torque. That's around 2,580 pound-feet. A production road truck carrying freight had entered territory that, not long before, sounded almost absurd. And this was where the DC-16's reputation began to become something bigger than horsepower. Because horsepower gets attention. Torque gets the truck moving. Imagine a fully loaded heavy-haul combination sitting at the bottom of a long grade. The trailer is heavy. The road is climbing. The engine doesn't care. That is what the V8 was built to do. And Scania didn't need to spin it to some ridiculous engine speed to create the effect. The torque arrived low in the rev range. The engine could deliver its strongest pulling force around the kind of engine speeds where a truck actually works. That changes the entire driving experience. Instead of waiting for the tachometer to climb, the driver feels the engine shove against the load. The truck settles down. The drivetrain loads up. And the hill becomes a problem of gearing and traction rather than a desperate battle for power. This was the DC-16 philosophy. But then came an even bigger question. Why did an engine this capable never become a common sight on American highways? To answer that, you have to stop thinking about the engine for a moment. And look at the truck around it. The United States developed a very different heavy trucking culture. For decades, American truck buyers became deeply attached to manufacturers such as Peterbilt, Kenworth, Freightliner, Mack, International, and others. The conventional hooded truck became an icon. The driver sat behind a long hood. The engine lived underneath it. The truck was designed around American roads, American regulations, American dealer networks, American parts systems, and American fleet habits. Scania came from another world. European trucks often favored cab-over-engine designs because road space, maneuverability, and vehicle length mattered differently. European regulations and operating conditions pushed manufacturers toward compact, efficient packages. A truck built for the European market wasn't simply an American truck with a different badge. It was a different answer to a different question. And that created a huge barrier. Because selling a great engine isn't enough. You have to sell the entire machine around it. You need dealerships. You need parts. You need technicians. You need financing. You need fleet support. You need resale confidence. And most importantly, you need customers who are willing to abandon an established ecosystem. That's where Scania faced the real battle. The DC-16 could be brilliant. But an American fleet manager doesn't buy an engine in isolation. He buys uptime. He buys support. He buys familiarity. He buys the confidence that a truck won't become an expensive science project the moment something goes wrong 2 states away from home. And American trucking already had enormous domestic ecosystems built around established manufacturers. That made the challenge much bigger than horsepower. It was a business problem. And then there was another issue. Emissions. The modern DC-16 became increasingly sophisticated because the world demanded cleaner diesel engines. Scania incorporated technologies such as high-pressure fuel injection, advanced turbocharging, exhaust gas management, and selective catalytic reduction. The result was remarkable. But every new emissions technology adds complexity. The modern diesel engine is no longer just pistons, rods, valves, injectors, and a turbocharger. It is an entire system. The engine computer monitors conditions. Fuel injection has to be precise. Airflow matters. Exhaust temperature matters. Aftertreatment matters. SCR uses a chemical reaction to reduce nitrogen oxides in the exhaust. The engine has to produce power while also controlling what leaves the tailpipe. And Scania became extremely good at making that system work together. But American trucking had its own emissions path. Different rules. Different certification requirements. Different market expectations. Different service infrastructure. And that's important because people sometimes assume that an engine doesn't appear everywhere simply because it isn't good enough. That's not how heavy trucks work. An engine can be technically brilliant and still lose a market. Because the truck business isn't a horsepower contest. It's an ecosystem contest. And the DC16 found itself on the outside of one of the world's biggest trucking ecosystems. But here's where the story gets interesting. Because while the DC16 never became a common sight powering American highway tractors, Scania didn't disappear from North America. Not at all. Scania continued supplying engines for industrial and marine applications. Today, Scania's North American operation lists its 16-liter industrial engine family in the 500 to 770 horsepower range. That means the same basic philosophy that made the V8 famous in trucks could still find work in machines where uptime matters more than brand familiarity. Power generation, material handling, heavy industrial equipment, marine applications. These are places where an engine doesn't need to be parked at a truck stop every night to prove its value. It simply has to work. Hour after hour. Load after load. And that may actually be the best way to understand the DC16. It wasn't built to impress people at a dealership. It was built to disappear into the job. That sounds strange. But that's what great industrial engineering often does. The best engine isn't necessarily the one that looks spectacular. It's the one nobody notices because it keeps running. Think about a generator running behind a facility. A machine moving cargo around a port. A vessel pushing through rough water. A piece of heavy equipment working in heat, dust, or freezing conditions. Nobody cares how beautiful the engine sounds. They care whether it starts. They care whether it makes power. They care whether it survives another shift. And that is where the DC16's design philosophy becomes clear. Scania's V8 was never simply about producing a giant horsepower number. The company was obsessed with usable performance. Power at low engine speed. Torque where it matters. Efficient combustion. Long service life. And an engine architecture that could continue evolving as regulations changed. The numbers kept climbing. The 730 horsepower generation was eventually joined by even more powerful versions. Then came the modern V8 family. In 2020, Scania introduced a new 4-engine V8 range. The top version was the one that made headlines. 770 horsepower. 3,700 Newton-meters of torque. That's approximately 2,730 pound-feet. At this point, the engine was no longer simply powerful. It was outrageous by conventional heavy truck standards. And yet Scania's engineers weren't just chasing power. The company reported improvements in fuel efficiency through a broader powertrain update that included a revised gearbox, turbocharger improvements, reduced internal friction, and improved exhaust after treatment. That's an important distinction. Anyone can demand more fuel and produce more power. The real engineering challenge is producing more usable power while controlling the cost of making it. Because every truck operator eventually asks the same question. How much does it cost to move 1 ton 1 mile? Not how impressive is the dyno sheet. Not how loud is the engine. Not how big is the displacement. How much does it cost to do the job? And that's why the DC16 became so important. It represented the Scandinavian approach to heavy transport at its most extreme. A big V8. Huge torque. Advanced electronics. Sophisticated emissions control. And a powertrain designed to work efficiently as one complete system. But there is one more reason American truck enthusiasts might find the DC16 fascinating. It represents a road not taken. Imagine if Scania had established a massive conventional truck presence across the United States decades earlier. Imagine American truck stops filled with long-hood Scania tractors. Imagine fleets choosing between a Scania V8 and the engines that became household names in American trucking. Imagine mechanics arguing over which engine was better. Would the DC16 have become an American legend? Maybe. But history doesn't work that way. The market had already developed its own winners. The American truck wasn't merely a machine. It had become culture. The long hood. The chrome. The sleeper. The independent owner-operator. The familiar engine brands. The giant dealer networks. The roadside repair infrastructure. Scania was entering a game where the rules had already been written. And perhaps that's the hidden truth behind the title. The Scania DC16 didn't vanish from American roads because it was defeated by an inferior engine. It largely never had the opportunity to become a mainstream American highway engine in the first place. Its absence is less about failure, and more about geography, regulation, market structure, and history. But the engine itself kept evolving. And the evolution tells us something important about diesel technology. The DC16 began as a response to the limitations of an older V8. Then it became a larger 16-liter platform. Then 16.4 liters. Then 730 horsepower. Then 770. And throughout that journey, one thing remained. The V8 was still expected to deliver enormous power without turning itself into a disposable machine. That's difficult. Very difficult. Because increasing cylinder pressure, boosting power, controlling emissions, and maintaining durability all pull engineering in different directions. Push one too far, and something else suffers. More power can mean more heat. More heat can mean more stress. More fuel can mean more emissions. More emissions equipment can mean more complexity. And higher cylinder pressures can place enormous demands on pistons, bearings, cylinder heads, blocks, cooling systems, and the entire drivetrain. The DC16 survived that engineering balancing act by evolving rather than standing still. That's why the compacted graphite iron block mattered. That's why advanced fuel injection mattered. That's why turbocharger development mattered. That's why exhaust aftertreatment mattered. And that's why the modern DC16 is almost nothing like the V8 that appeared at the beginning of the 16-liter story. The name survived. The philosophy survived. But the technology underneath it changed dramatically. And then you hear the engine. That's the part numbers don't explain. A Scania V8 doesn't sound like an American inline-six. It has a different pulse. A different rhythm. A different character. That sound became part of the legend. Drivers didn't simply talk about horsepower. They talked about the V8. The feeling. The pull. The sound under load. The way it climbed. The way the truck behaved when the road disappeared upward. And that's why the engine developed a following far beyond the technical specifications. For some truckers, the V8 became an identity. But there is a deeper lesson here. Diesel engines don't become legendary because they're the biggest. They become legendary because they solve a problem better than people expected. The DC16 solved the problem of moving huge loads with tremendous power while continuing to evolve through increasingly difficult emissions standards. It proved that a modern diesel didn't have to choose between strength and sophistication. It could have both. And that's what makes the American absence so strange. In a country obsessed with big engines, big trucks, and long-distance freight, you would think a 16.4-liter V8 producing up to 770 horsepower and 3,700 Newton-meters of torque would be impossible to ignore. But American trucking is full of engines that became famous because they were available. The DC16 became famous because it wasn't. That's a very different kind of legend. And maybe that's why the engine deserves another look today. Because when people talk about classic American diesels, the conversation usually circles around familiar names. Cummins, Caterpillar, Detroit Diesel, Mack. Those engines shaped American trucking. But across the Atlantic, another school of diesel engineering was developing an entirely different interpretation of what a heavy-duty engine could be. And the Scania DC16 was its thunderous V8 answer. A machine capable of turning 16.4 liters of displacement into enough torque to make enormous combinations feel almost manageable. An engine that grew from a 480 horsepower generation into a 730 horsepower giant, and eventually into a 770 horsepower modern powerhouse. An engine that moved beyond trucks and into industrial, marine, and power generation work. An engine that didn't need to conquer American highways to prove what it could do. Because perhaps the greatest irony is this. The DC16 never needed to become an American icon. It became something else. A reminder that engineering greatness isn't always determined by how many trucks you see at the nearest truck stop. Sometimes the most interesting machines are the ones that built industries somewhere else. The ones that worked while nobody was watching. The ones that crossed borders without becoming household names. And the ones that disappeared from one road system, only to keep working somewhere far beyond it. So the next time you see a massive Scania V8 working in Europe, Australia, or an industrial application, remember what you're actually looking at. Not just a big diesel. You're looking at the latest chapter of a V8 philosophy that began more than half a century ago. A philosophy built around torque, durability, efficiency, and the simple belief that a truck should never be afraid of the load behind it. The American highways may never have been filled with DC16-powered Scania tractors. But that doesn't mean the engine lost. In many ways, it means the opposite. It found the roads, industries, and machines that needed it most. And it kept evolving. Because great diesel engines don't always disappear when their moment is over. Sometimes they simply move somewhere else. And keep working. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most powerful and overlooked diesel V8s ever built, subscribe to the channel. Because there are plenty of engines with incredible stories hiding behind the names most people already know. And the next one might be even harder to explain.